my name is Isabella Donnelly. I work with Woodlands of Ireland, and we're delighted to have Dr. Jenni Roche from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, who's a woodland specialist with NPWS. So today, Jenni will be giving us an overview on the diversity and the distribution of Ireland's native trees. And then we're also delighted to have Brian Clifford from Forest Service and the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine as well joining us today. And Brian is going to be presenting on the National Register of Forest Basic Material and Considerations for Seed Collection. So I'll hand you over. Sorry, actually, before that, just a few housekeeping. So the webinar is being recorded and will be distributed afterwards on our social media. Also, questions as they arrive can be asked with the Q&A function. And we have some time at the end where we'll go through the questions, and Jenni and Brian will answer them as best they can. So I think that's everything then. I think it's okay to hand over to yourself then, Jenni. I'll just stop sharing now and let you pop your webinar up. So.
Okay, thanks Isabella. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, just it's in the presenter. It's in
okay.
No problem.
There we go. Is that okay? Great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so as a starting point for today's talk, I've compiled a list of Ireland's native trees and selected native shrubs. This list of 36 species has been adapted from Webb's An Irish Flora by John Parnell and Tom Curtis. And this was published in 2012, and it's a comprehensive guide to the plants which grow in the wild in Ireland, both native and naturalized, although today we're focusing on the native species. All of our native trees are listed here, and the selection of native shrubs is somewhat subjective. Some native shrubs, such as gorse, have been excluded on the basis that they're less relevant to seed collection for woodland planting. And some small low-growing species have been excluded, as well as shrub species which are not usually associated with woodland or hedgerow habitats. You can see all the familiar native trees are listed here, along with some rarities which have much more restricted distributions in Ireland. Unfortunately, I won't have time today to tell you about all of these species, but I will give a brief introduction to most of them. And before we look at the present distribution patterns of tree species in Ireland, let's look at how they got here. Fossil pollen evidence shows that the first trees to arrive in Ireland after the last ice age were low-growing species of birch and juniper. And as climatic conditions improved, other species began to arrive here. These maps, prepared by Fraser Mitchell of Trinity College, show how various types of trees colonized Ireland shortly after the last ice age. The dark line shows how far north the pioneer species hazel and pine had gotten by 9,500 years ago. The lighter line shows their progress by 9,000 years ago, with hazel having reached the north of the country by that time. Pine was a little bit slower, and it reached the north of the country by 8,500 years ago. Similarly, these maps show the migration pattern of elm and oak, which had arrived in Ireland by 9,000 years ago. Elm reached the north by 8,500 years ago, but oak was a little bit slower moving, reaching the north by 8,000 years ago. Interestingly, these tree species appear to have moved up through Ireland from the south, from continental Europe rather than from Britain, at a time when sea levels were much lower than they are today. The genetics of Irish oak populations also support this idea of colonization from continental Europe. Now we'll have a look at the present distribution and habitat requirements of some of Ireland's native trees and shrubs, starting with the species which are most widespread and familiar to all of us, I'm sure. So I've got profiles of various native species with images, a description from Webb's Irish Flora about their habitat requirements and their frequency in Ireland. And these maps are taken from the BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. And the maps are freely available from their website, which is a great resource of information. So alder is a species of riverbanks, lake shores, and damp woods. It's very abundant, and it's found virtually ubiquitously throughout the country. Grey willow is a species found in hedges, thickets, and damp woods. It's also very frequent, and again, found almost throughout the entire country. Ash is a species of hedges, woods, and rocky places. It's very abundant, especially on limestone soils. And hazel is a species of woods and scrub, rocky places and hedges, and it's locally abundant and found throughout most of the country, except in the very far west. Some places there it's absent. Hawthorn is a species of hedges and woods throughout Ireland, and it's locally frequent in those habitats. And blackthorn, similarly, is a species of hedges, thickets, and rocky places, and it's very frequent in Ireland, being found almost everywhere, except in a little patch of northwest Mayo. And lastly, holly is a species of woods, hedges, and rocky ground, and again, very frequent almost throughout the entire country. So now we'll have a look at some species with different distributions. These are the two native species of birch, downy birch and silver birch. So downy birch is the more common and widespread of the two. It's found in woods, especially on acid soils, and scrub in mountain glens. It's very frequent and locally abundant. Whereas the silver birch is a species found on stony lake shores, margins of raised bogs, and locally in woods, and its distribution is more dispersed in the west of Ireland, and it's found occasionally. These are the two native species of oak, the pedunculate oak and the sessile oak. Pedunculate oak is found in woods and hedges, chiefly in the lowlands and on richer soils. It's been widely planted and it's very frequent throughout most of Ireland. The sessile oak is most commonly found on acid soils and in mountain districts. And it's very frequent in suitable habitats, but it's absent from a lot of the Irish Midlands. So the two species have quite a different distribution pattern. This is the strawberry tree, which is found in wood margins, on rocky lake shores and islands. It's particularly frequent near Killarney, and it's present very locally in other parts of the southwest. And it's also thought to be native at Lough Gill in County Sligo. The other populations marked on the map here are probably planted and not native, but the population at Lough Gill is very significant because it's thought to be the northernmost population through the entire global distribution of the species. So Ireland is actually very important in this species distribution. Now, this is the Scots pine, which is or was widely thought to have become extinct in Ireland around 400 AD. It was reintroduced in the 17th century, and it's now widely planted and has naturalized in several places, mainly in the west of Ireland. Because of its complex history, its native status was disputed in Ireland. But recent research by myself, Alwyn McGeever, and Fraser Mitchell at Trinity College found that fossil pollen evidence indicates that a native population of Scots pine has survived in the Burren in County Clare. So there's one native dot on the map. Now, this is another one of our native conifers, the yew. And yew is found in woods, on lake islands, cliffs and rocky ground. It's rather rare in the west and north of Ireland. Occasionally it gets sown by birds who have eaten the berries from gardens. And yew is particularly sensitive to browsing by grazing animals. So in fact, this has quite an effect on its distribution. And in areas with heavy grazing, this is where you tend to only find yew on lake islands and cliffs because those areas are less accessible to grazing animals. Now, here are the two native types of buckthorn. The first is alder buckthorn, Frangula alnus, and it's a species of rocky places, lake shores, and other seasonally flooded habitats. And it's found occasionally in the west and centre of the country, but it's very rare elsewhere. And then we have buckthorn, or purging buckthorn, as it's sometimes known. This is Rhamnus cathartica. The two species are in different genera, but they're both called buckthorn. And this buckthorn is found in limestone pavement, hedgerows, fens, and boggy places, and it's also a very rare species in Ireland. Now, onto the sorbus species, and this is rowan, which is the most common of the sorbus species in Ireland. And you can see from the map there, it's very widespread, found through most of the country. And its typical habitats are glens, rocky places, hedgerows, and by mountain streams. But we have a number of other sorbus species in Ireland, all of which are white beams. And some of these are very rare and restricted in their distributions. Sorbus aria, the white beam, is rare as a native in Ireland, but the native populations are locally frequent in County Galway, and the species is scattered as an obvious introduction, which has been planted in elsewhere. And we also have Irish whitebeam, Sorbus hibernica, which is an endemic species. And that means that Ireland is the only place where this species is found globally. So it's of extremely high conservation importance. And this species is found in woods, cliffs, rocky places, and usually on calcareous soils, mainly in the centre of the country. And it's only found occasionally. This species is included on the red list of threatened vascular plants in Ireland, and its status has been assessed as vulnerable, which means that it has a high risk of extinction in the wild. Other rare whitebeam species are the rock whitebeam, which is found mainly in the west and north, and it's occasional, and it's shown in the picture there. And even rarer than rock whitebeam are English whitebeam, which is only found in the Killarney area. And that is also a red listed species, which is considered as endangered. So that means it's at a very high risk of extinction in the wild. And we also have the Devon whitebeam, which is found only in the southeast of the country. And that too is endangered. And I should also note that the rock whitebeam is red listed as vulnerable. So those 4 species are very rare and threatened in Ireland. And because these species have such restricted and localized distributions, they shouldn't be included in planting schemes without agreement from NPWS, because these species are the subject of rare plant conservation efforts. Seeds should not be collected from these rare and threatened species except by agreement with NPWS. Now, this is the wild cherry, which is found in woods and hedges, and it's occasional. It's found through much of Ireland, but it's more sparsely distributed in the west. And this is the rarer native species of cherry, the bird cherry, and that's found in woods and damp rocky places. It's quite frequent in the northwest of Ireland, but elsewhere it's rare and often planted. And lastly, the aspen. This species is fairly frequent as a native in wild or rocky places in the west of Ireland, in the north and east. And it's rarer in hedges in the east and southeast, and it's sometimes planted. It's shown in the picture there and on the map. And we also have a rarer species of poplar, the black poplar. That's probably native in the south and centre of Ireland, though it was planted in the past and it is only found occasionally. Okay, so that's the last of the species profiles that we'll have time for today. But as we've seen, each tree species has its own ecological niche. And in effect, plant species with similar niches tend to occur together in suitable habitats. So they form recognizable plant communities, not just of trees, but also of other plants, bryophytes, lichens. And to give you an example of the different woodland plant communities that we generally see in Ireland, I've adapted the list from Fawcett's Guide to Habitats in Ireland. So on poorer acidic soils, we tend to find generally sessile oak dominating, with birch and holly. And then on drier base-rich soils, we tend to have pedunculate oak dominating, with ash and hazel. On waterlogged but reasonably fertile soils, we see pedunculate oak with ash. And then in the lower reaches of rivers, on the river margins and on river islands where you have periodic flooding, we tend to get communities dominated by various species of willow. On other wet ground and also in the vicinity of rivers, we get willow, alder and ash woodland. And on poorer peaty soils, we get birch dominating, although you may get rowan, willow, oak growing with that birch. And then the rarest of our woodland communities is yew woodland. We only have 6 yew woodland stands in Ireland, and these tend to be found on limestone outcrops. Okay, so that's the overview of the diversity and distribution of our native tree species. I'd like to thank the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland for the use of their maps, and Sean O'Gueen, a colleague in NPWS, for the use of his photos. Thanks also to Woodlands of Ireland for the invitation to speak to you today, and thank you for listening.
That's fantastic. Thanks a million, Jenny. Very informative and great resource there from the Botanical Society. So we have a few questions in. So if anybody has any more questions for Jenny, pop them into the Q&A and we'll come to them at the end on that. So with that, I'll introduce Brian to deliver his presentation to us. So the floor is all yours, Brian. Thanks a million.
Thanks very much. I'll just start sharing this here now. Yeah, can you see this as well?
Perfect. Thanks, Brian.
Okay. Yeah, just to say thanks very much to the Woodlands of Ireland for inviting me here today. My name is Brian Clifford. I'm a forestry inspector with the Forest Sector Development Division of the Department of Agriculture. And I suppose my focus at the moment is really on forest genetic resources. And so I'm going to talk today about the National Register of Forest Basic Material and considerations for seed collection. So it's really, I suppose, to follow on from Jenni's talk and kind of focus on how we use forest genetics, or forest genetic resources. And so I'll first, I suppose, just maybe define it and what it is, why they're important. Then I'll talk a little bit about basic material. So this is what we call, I suppose, the seeds and the forests and the trees, in terms of where reproductive material comes from. So I'll describe then how it's marketed and how it's categorized and described. And then I'll go into the register itself in terms of the resource that we currently have on it. And then I might just broaden the talk a little bit more and discuss genetic considerations, the seed collection and the use of FGR, focusing on a series of recommendations which came out of the Clifford Council Working Group on Forest Genetics. So I suppose, first of all, what are forest genetics? So under the FAO definition in 2014, these are the heritable materials within and among trees and other woody plants that are of actual or potential economic, environmental, scientific, or societal value. So they consist of the seeds, the standing trees, the entire forests. So as we heard from Jenni, Ireland's home to a wide range of native trees, but also a range of non-native naturalized tree species. And in terms of the FGR and the requirement for forest reproductive material, there's quite large amounts required for forestry programs, including native woodland establishment scheme. So for these planting schemes to be successful, it requires material to be genetically and phenotypically suited to the site and also of high quality. I suppose this is really essential for sustainable forest management. And why is it so important? I suppose genetic diversity in terms of disease, it's very important. I suppose the capacity of trees and other forest organisms to develop resistance or tolerance to biotic and abiotic stresses, as well as adapt to changing climates, depends on genetic diversity. And that same diversity also permits selection and breeding for optimization of forest products and ecosystem services, and also a strong need to conserve that diversity with the growing threat of climate change. So to do all this, we need a strong system of control of the use of forest reproductive material. And that really comes under the directive for the marketing of forest reproductive material, 1999-105 EC. This regulation provides a system for the control of seed cuttings, planting stock that is used for forestry purposes. And I suppose I'm really just going to focus today on the National Register and the background to that. My colleague next week or in the following weeks will discuss in a little bit more detail on the regulation and how it's described concerning tree seed collection, nursery production, and delivery of plants to the consumer. So the focus today really it's on the register in terms of how we describe that basic material, what it is, and what are the categories. So in terms of the types, I suppose these are quite important in determining, I suppose, the diversity maybe of the material that you're planting in the forest. It's broken down into seed source, seed stand, and seed orchards, as well as parents and families, clones and clonal mixtures. For the purpose of today's talk, I'm really going to focus on those three in the red box. So in terms of seed source, when you see it on your master's certificate, your provenance certificate, the seed source really refers to, can either be a single tree or a collection of trees within a regional province. Whereas a seed stand is a specifically defined area or groups within identified boundaries. So this is your forest area. While then a seed orchard, these are sources based on known individuals derived from tree breeding programs. So we know the performance of the individual components of the orchard, basically. So these are all then defined into quality categories, going from the, I suppose, in terms of the least known information and the source identified. So these basically all we know is the geographic information associated with them, with no real quality criteria associated with it. Then we have selected. These come from stands showing superior characteristics such as better form, growth rate, or health. Then we have the improved classes, so qualified, which are derived from selection of superior individual trees, which have not undergone any form of testing. And then you have the tested class, which is derived from selection of individual trees, which have been evaluated for genetic gain in comparison with an acceptable standard, and then shown to be superior. So I suppose in terms of native woodlands, it's really those source identified and selected categories that are, I suppose, of the most interest. So this source identified category, I think Jenni mentioned rock forest there earlier, so there it is again on the right side. But so this source identified category can either be a seed source or a stand located in a single region of province. So Ireland is considered one single region of province. In terms of the origin, it has to be described whether it's autochthonous or non-autochthonous. So autochthonous basically means that there's been a continuous presence of the seed source or stand at that location, so which indicates its nativeness, whether it's indigenous or non-indigenous. So indigenous means the material could be moved, but moved from within that same region of province. And then if you don't know either of those things, it has to be declared. So it would state unknown. And then there's also elevation associated with it. And the key thing really is that there's no selection criteria relating to the quality of the basic material. So then you have the selected class, which refers to stand only. So not seed source, but stand only. The same origin information is required as source identified. But the key is that it's phenotypically selected at the population level. So the series of selection criteria are outlined there. The origin, the isolation in terms of they must be situated at sufficient distance from poor stands of the same species. In terms of the effective size, stand must consist of one or more groups of trees, well distributed and sufficiently numerous to ensure adequate interpollination. The age and development, they have to be old enough that the person making the assessment they have to basically phenotypically express themselves. So the person making the assessment can make a determination. They have to be sufficiently uniform. They have to show that they're adapted to the ecological conditions prevailing in the region. And the health and resistance have to be free from general attack from organisms and show resistance to adverse climate or site conditions. And then in terms of, I suppose, from a forester's point of view, they should be from increased volume production and wood quality. So on the right-hand side there, you see, I suppose, a diagram of a plus tree in terms of looking at timber straightness and circularity and flat branching habitat and lack of equicormix and things like this. So the selected class is really, you're moving into the desirability from I suppose that kind of timber production ecosystem service, and I suppose then you're moving. So the key is that the selected is at the population level, whereas then when you get into the tree selection and breeding side of things, you're really drilling down into knowing the performance of individual components. So qualified and tested, these are the orchards and parents of families of clonal mixtures. So again, the origin must be known, but I suppose it's phenotypically selected at the individual level. So I suppose taking that plus tree example, there are orchards made up of plus trees. So the example on the right-hand side, there are qualified orchards in alder, downy birch, and there's it's not in the image there, but there's also qualified orchards in Scots pine. So then moving on to the tested status, again, it's fulfilling the criteria of qualified, but the key difference here is that there's a genetic gain associated with the material. So we know roughly, or not roughly, but there's statistical tests which establish the superiority of the material versus the control. So that we don't, while we have qualified orchards in some native species, there's currently no tested native species. Ash was there in the past, but obviously with ash dieback, that's no longer the case. So how does this applied really? So this is a table taken from the Native Woodland Scheme document, and it drills down into those seed sources and FRM categories. So if you look at the likes of, say, oak, the oak species, and Scots pine, there's a requirement that the material comes from stands as opposed to seed sources, whereas all other eligible species, the minor components, minor species, are seed sources are eligible. So I suppose that's the really key thing there to kind of keep in mind in terms of the Native Woodland Scheme. So I suppose that's the background in terms of how material is described and categorized. But I suppose now moving on to what we have currently registered. So under the FRM directive, member states are required to compile a national register of approved basic material. So in Ireland, the Department of Agriculture carries this out, and we maintain and update that register every year. So on your right hand side, I suppose it's just a zoomed out image of the various entities that are registered around the country across species. So the table here is a summary table of the register. This is taken from the Department of Agriculture's Forest Statistics 2020. And it lists all those species, both native and non-native, according to their FRM quality class. So again, these will not include seed sources. These are seed stands or seed orchards. So looking at native species, you've alder, birch, ash, Scots pine, cherry, and then down into the oaks. Sorry that the red boxes seem to have moved slightly on me, so, but you get the picture. So I suppose looking at, I suppose drilling down into those native species, where are they occurring, and I suppose are they of native origin? And I suppose that's particularly interesting for this talk and for the native woodland scheme. So how many of those native species on the register are autochthonous or indigenous? So I suppose of those stand forming species, we've quite a few in alder, ash, sessile oak, and pedunculate oak. And they're, I suppose it's probably reflecting on where the NPWS sites are, but there's the distribution there is color coded in the map on the right hand side. And then in terms of the orchards and the qualified classes, so again, I mentioned earlier, we have downy birch in qualified material, so that's a Chagas from program. It's in production and producing seed. We have Scots pine, these are of Scottish origin. Some would have been +3 selected in Scotland, and some have been +3s selected in Ireland from Scottish material that was grown in stands. And then in oak, we have a seedling seed orchard established, but it's not in production. And then there's also sessile pedunculate oak in development. So I suppose we're moving up the classes in terms of those quality classes in the native species. So I suppose just moving on a little bit from that, I suppose one of the other aspects I was asked to have a quick discussion on is, I suppose, genetic considerations in seed collection. I suppose there's across the Department of Agriculture schemes, there's a large supply of appropriate forestry production material required. There's increased native requirements to certain native woodland scheme, but also agri-environmental schemes. As we know, and I think the Woodlands of Ireland are kind of quite hot on this in terms of the kind of working group, and there's quite large barriers to supply in terms of the group, limited number of seed years, oak in particular, limited economics of seed collection, as well as seed stand management. I suppose for all the seed stands that are on the National Register of Basic Material, in terms of collection, it's quite limited into how many are actually utilised. And beyond that, then the ones that are utilised tend to be confined to specific regions. So then on the demand side, from the nursery's point of view, the anticipation of yearly demand is quite difficult. It's a 2-3-year lead-in time, and they're exposed to quite a lot of external factors. And then on top of that, there's the changing climate and its impact on the adaptability of native seed sources. And then there's a need to conserve that diversity, genetic diversity that we have, in order to make sure we have a healthy forests in the future. So I suppose there's quite a lot of challenges, and these considerations are discussed quite at length by the Clifford Council Working Group on Forest Resources, and they produced a report in December last year. Then just on your right hand side there, Sustainable Development Conservation 2020-2030. So there's quite a few recommendations in that report. Strategy implementation, coordination, genetic options in terms of climate change adaptation, the forest genetic resource development requirements, and gene conservation requirements. I know I'm kind of pushed for time, so, but not to come drill in too much, but I'm just going to mention these two particular points on genetic options for climate change adaptation, as well as the FGA development requirements. So taking the second one first, the development requirements, I suppose the group came up with a series of solutions to potentially addressing these challenges. One is to keep going with the seed stand registration program, to look at producing an annual assessment of seed cropping. Quite a key one was looking at a seed stand activation program, so to increase the number and distribution of seed stands from which seed is collected. And I suppose a key part in delivering that is the Department of Agriculture's grant aid scheme on seed stands and seed orchard establishment. But also gave recommendations around training of seed collectors, I should say, and establishment to continue with investment in tree selection and breeding programs to increase the number of orchards. So those were kind of on that development requirement solutions that were put forward. And then on the, I suppose, the climate change adaptation piece and kind of genetic considerations we need to kind of look at in that space. I suppose in terms of climate change, projects of Ireland, basically we're going to look at an increase in seasonal temperature in certain area is pretty much certain, as well as a decrease in some rainfall in the eastern part of the country is more than likely, as well as that the climate models are indicating a frequency of extreme events. So obviously trees are long-lived species, therefore they need to be sufficiently adapted to today's climate as well as tomorrow's. So what was proposed, and I suppose especially in the context of native woodlands, I suppose like most good, there's a lot of researchers there, so like good researchers, more researchers needed, was the answer. And so our understanding basically of genetic matters on issues such as adaptability of native tree populations to climate change is relatively limited. Therefore, we need to basically keep researching that area. But ultimately, in terms of using seed sources and things like that, a precautionary but pragmatic approach is required. One which promotes diversity, both between species and within species. So it's vital to use seed or cuttings collected from a wide enough range of parent trees in the source population. And then for native woodland establishment, again, a precautionary principle. And this is reflected in, I suppose, the Native Woodland Establishment Scheme, where it recommends native and local provinces first, and then a greater understanding of adaptive potential of native tree provinces is needed before we start recommending the use of non-native regions or provinces. I suppose where there's some flexibility is where in the use of non-Indigenous provinces is where there's a high timber quality as the primary objective. So I suppose in the department's oak GPC and things like this. In this case, if selected or improved planting material is preferable. So I suppose those were the kind of recommendations and considerations that were coming out of the group and the kind of discussions that were ongoing. So yeah, I suppose just highlighting that in red there, I suppose that was the kind of particular recommendation around assessing adaptive potential of current populations before really focusing on looking at non-natives or non-Indigenous provinces for native woodland establishment. So yeah, just to conclude then, so concluding remarks, I suppose it's necessary to use reproductive material which is genetically and phenotypically suited to the site. This is essential for sustainable forest management. Marketed reproductive material needs to be characterised and true to name, and this is to ensure, I suppose, that the forest owner and the forester and who's establishing the site is able to make the right decision on the right tree in the right place. We have a national register of forest-based material, which is the source of all information on approved-based material. The code for report there lists recommendations for the sustainable use and conservation of forest reports or forest resources. There's an interim recommendation implementation plan due in February, and I suppose for further information, really, the contact that email address there, frm@agriculture.gov.ie. So I suppose for anything to do with registering a seed stands or further information on what we've discussed today. And I suppose just to highlight again that there will be a follow-on webinar in 2 or 3 weeks, which will give a more detailed overview on the FRM regulation concerning tree seed collection and further down the supply chain as a nursery production and delivery of plants to the consumer. So that's it. And just to say thanks again to Woodlands of Ireland for organising today and to have me give this talk. So thank you.